Hello， 大家好，我是 DIGITIMES 新闻中心主编何志忠，也是这一次苹果在中国作者访谈的主持人。我们很高兴邀请到 Patrick McGee 来到现场。苹果在中国是纽约时报跟经济学人精选2025年度的最佳书籍。这一次一起参加访谈的还有我们的研究资深副总黄逸平，以及我们的新闻编辑同仁，也是书迷的张新明。欢迎各位。Hello everyone, I'm Julian Ho, Managing Editor at the DIGITIMES. Today we are very happy to welcome Patrick McGee, the author of Apple in China. Apple in China was selected as one of the best books of 2025 by the New York Times and Economist. So we are very honored to have Patrick with us today. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Julian.
Okay, our another guest is Eric Huang, Senior VP of Research at DIGITIMES. So he leads our flagship research projects and focuses on industry data and analysis. Hello, Eric.
Hi.
And our third guest is Rod, is my coworker and editor from our news team, and also a big fan of Apple in China. So hello, Rod.
Hello, Julian. Hello, everyone.
Okay, welcome. So let me start with a simple question for Patrick. So why do you decide to write Apple in China, and what made you want to tell this story?
So I'd been covering Apple for the Financial Times for about 3 years, and I was writing a profile of Cristiano Amon, the CEO of Qualcomm, and I was asking him for some stories. And he told me that he was stuck in Taipei during a 14-day quarantine, and while he was trying to get to the fabs to see the Qualcomm chips and sort of make sure that they were being built correctly and all that. And I remember being confused by the story because I said, well, right, but you designed the chips, you don't make the chips, so why did you have to go to Taiwan? And he said, because we follow the Apple model.
Apple model.
And I was covering Apple, and I thought, what the hell is the Apple model? So that was sort of like, I was almost shamed and embarrassed into thinking, I don't know what that is. So I went to go look into it, thinking there must be a book that explains how Apple manufactures its products and how it's had an influence on someone like Qualcomm. And it didn't exist. And there wasn't really much writing on it at all in magazines or profiles. So I quickly realized there were 3 books about Apple that I wanted to read, and they didn't exist, so I decided to write it. So the 3 big stories are Apple being nearly bankrupt in 1996 and becoming the world's most valuable company. That would be a great book that has not been written. The other one was how Apple actually makes its products. So not just how it conceives of the product and how it designs it, but how does it actually make it? I think everyone knows Foxconn is involved, but that's usually the extent of their understanding. And the third book was, you don't just sort of work with China without having the right political connections. And what are those political connections? I mean, who makes those decisions for Apple? None of that was clear to me either. So Apple in China was an attempt to answer all 3 of those questions and write 3 books in one.
Okay. In recent years, the U.S.-China trade war has changed many global industries, and the people now talk a lot about geopolitics and supply chain. So how do you see the geopolitics affecting the global tech industry today?
Yeah, I think it's a major shift. So Ian Bremmer, the sort of political analyst, has talked about this period where there was a geopolitical recession. A great example, outside of the Apple supply chain would be Angela Merkel signing a deal to rely on Russia for natural gas. Great idea until Russia invaded Ukraine. And then, all of a sudden, Germany has a major problem on its hands. And so this is just one other example where I think the U.S. In particular, but even more Apple, just really didn't consider the geopolitical ramifications of what their actions were. So in Supply Chain 101, you'd be taught you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And yet here's the world's most sophisticated company absolutely doing that. And, it's not just any basket, it's become the biggest adversary to America.
Okay. Eric, from a research perspective, so how do you see the rise of the red supply chain, and how important is the China Plus One strategy right now?
I think the rise of the red supply chain has been separated into several phases. Phase 1 is in the PC era. Taiwanese company set up their factory in China for low-cost land and labor. And after year 2000, the last notebook supply chain moved to China. So China now have the very strong PC supply chain. That's the first phase. Taiwan's company nurture, train the laborers and engineers to do PC production and solve the technical issues. Then move to the second phase. That's the smartphone era. That's what Patrick mentioned in his book. Apple trained the Taiwanese company and also the supply chain, not just Taiwanese company, but also like a Korean company and Japanese company, etc.
Yeah.
But they concentrate their site into China. And I think during the late stage of the PC era, some technicians and they found that they have enough skills. They know how to do business. They know how to set up the factory. So they leave their Taiwanese company, set up their own company. So when Apple try to find the suppliers, and more Chinese company rise and take the orders, but not just Apple, because at that time, several major Chinese smartphone brand, they grabbed the market share and became bigger and bigger, like Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, etc. And for the local Chinese brand, they tend to use Chinese suppliers if they can.
Yeah.
So Chinese supplier become bigger and bigger. So I think in China has the most strong and efficiency and complete smartphone supply chain, and many of them are Chinese makers. That's the first question that you asked. And for the second question about China Plus One, I think nowadays not just China Plus One, but also Taiwan Plus One, because Pelosi visit Taiwan, then the cross-trade, there's a tension. So many companies, they have their contingent plan to need to find out capacity and supplier not in China and not in Taiwan. So and I think after the COVID-19 and after Pelosi visit Taiwan, and many companies, they try to set up their factory and put major capacity besides China and Taiwan. And major destinations are like Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand, Mexico and India, etc. So I think currently, during the Trump administration's tariff issue, now the supply chain movement is go to America, direct investment. Yeah.
Okay, Patrick, in your book you mentioned 5 major risks in the Apple-China relationship. So one of them is Huawei. You just talked about Huawei. In Taiwan, Huawei was once a major customer for many semiconductor companies, almost on the same level as Apple. But the US sanctions stopped Huawei from using the most advanced chips from TSMC.
Yeah.
At the same time, this pushed China to move faster toward technology self-reliance. So how do you view China's effort to build its own chip supply chain?
Well, there's this phrase, the necessity is the mother of an invention. And the sort of paradox is that if you're a US policymaker and you sort of want to go hard on the Chinese, you're actually sort of like doing something that, what do I want to say? Like it helps Beijing double down their own worldview, their own strategy, right? If you're in Beijing, you think the US is out to get you. So if you make those decisions on the part of the US that sort of confirm that worldview, then it means that they sort of work really hard and come up with their own models. So there's an irony that a soft approach to China, where actually Chinese companies are reliant on the Taiwanese, reliant on America, that's actually in the long term a better outcome. But it takes some political nuance to really describe that in an American context. So, I think there's a good argument that going after Huawei the way Trump did was actually a big mistake, because now Huawei is bigger and better than ever.
Okay, the same question. Eric, what is your opinion about Huawei?
Yeah, I think Huawei is quite unique from the global point of view when you see the tech industry. Because Huawei can do everything.
Yeah.
Huawei can do chip and even Huawei direct control at least 5 to 10 fabs. And Huawei can do like material and semiconductor equipment R&D and production. But also Huawei also do the full stack of the tech stack, not just semiconductor, but also system, software, and also Huawei provide cloud services. Huawei can do end-to-end solution from server rack, data center, power supply, physical facility, to telecom equipment, telecom network, to many edge devices like smartphone, notebook, surveillance devices, etc. So Huawei can do everything. Even compared to like Samsung, I think Huawei's business scope even bigger and complete than Samsung. So, and I think Huawei is the biggest buyer of the semiconductor in Chinese market. So Huawei used his buyer's power to enable the China's self-sufficient semiconductor supply chain, because Huawei can qualify materials, Huawei can qualify equipment, Huawei have its own fabs, and Huawei co-work with like SMIC and the CSMT very well. So Huawei now the highest priority is to for the self-sufficiency for the whole AI plus semiconductor supply chain, and Huawei's solution is the biggest have the biggest market share, and Huawei has the policy back the power to enable the whole ecosystem.
I could have really used you when I was researching the book, This is
your next book.
Well, no, but the current book. I mean, it took me so long to sort of connect the dots, and you just understand them all already. So I wish we spoke 2 years ago.
Okay. Patrick, Apple is moving some production to India and Vietnam to reduce its dependence on China. So do you still think it is very difficult for Apple to replace China as its main manufacturing base, and why?
Yeah, so I kind of disagree with the question. There are certain things that are going to Vietnam. I think that's kind of real. But diversification to Vietnam isn't really a geopolitical decision. It's a tariff-based decision. So if Washington's going to put tariffs on China, well, you just cross the border to northern Vietnam, build things there. All of those supply chains are just as dependent on the Chinese supply chains than anyone in China. It just happens to be across the border, right? There's a reason why it's all in northern Vietnam, not southern Vietnam. So it's the proximity to China. So I don't think that's actually much of an achievement. India is a pretty similar story. It's a little more complex, but essentially the iPhones that are quote unquote made in India are really just their final assembly is being done there. They're no less dependent on the Chinese supply chain than anything else. And as Apple wants to change that and fully bifurcate the supply chain, maybe something that's achievable in a 10 or 15 year period, they risk sort of making Beijing angry. And they risk their $70 billion business in China, where if Apple becomes known as like the poster child for de-risking from China, I think consumers in China could get upset. So like the Vietnam story, it's more about tariffs. It's about Narendra Modi's tariffs on China, right? If you want to sort of feed the homegrown market in India, you don't want a 20% tariff on iPhones, and you want to be able to send them to the United States, without risk of there being tariffs on India. But part of that's blown up a little bit because on Liberation Day, Trump put tariffs on India, on Vietnam, and on China. So that sort of put Apple in a difficult position, except that Apple's kind of too big to fail. And so they've never had to pay any of these big tariffs. There's small tariffs for the fentanyl allegations, but essentially they gain exemptions because Tim Cook knows how to placate an authoritarian, whether it's in Beijing or Washington.
Okay. From what you see today, so how are Chinese system makers expanding in India and Vietnam? Can this region really replace the rest supply chain, or is China still hard to replace in the near future?
I think it's difficult because first reason is that smartphone market has been saturated
Yeah.
So no one will do new investment. If companies want to do new investment, there will be high growth area like AI. So I think smartphone supply chain will be more and more centralized, and to some big suppliers, because no company will enter this saturated market.
Yeah.
And the second question is that the Chinese, as I mentioned, China has built the most comprehensive and efficient supply chain. It's hard to be replaced by Vietnam or India in next 5 to 10 years. And I think for India, because Apple moved the major capacity to India, not just Foxconn but also Tata Electronics. Yeah. And I think the first phase is to do final assembly, then move to like PCB assembly. Then some components, not key components, but some components like camera modules and enclosure, etc., will be local produced in India. But some critical parts like a semiconductor, like a display, China already have a big display supplier, and they grab the significant market share, surpass like a Samsung or LG display. So I think in terms of this, China now can produce like display and IC for many of the smartphone components. But I think in 5 to 10 years, Vietnam and India will not to achieve this kind of status.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Before we finish the first part, I'll pass to Rod for a question. So do you have any question for Patrick?
Okay, Patrick, I had a great time to reading your book, and had a few questions for you. Yeah, this is first one. Apple-related publications usually focus on Steve Jobs or top executives, but your book explores something different, which is Apple stepping away from manufacturing. Why do you think the manufacturing is the real key to understand Apple's relationship with China, and why is the shift of manufacturing capability so important for understand today's tech industry?
So it's sort of making the distinction between the Steve Jobs era and the Tim Cook era. Even that Tim Cook is the person that replaces Steve Jobs is really quite an interesting thing. I mean, you've got the greatest visionary of the last 100 years dying, and who replaces him? It's not Johnny Ive, it's not another visionary, it's the operations guy. And I think that decision at Apple sort of tells you a lot. And in a certain sense, I think we took in the media more than a decade to really understand why that was the case. I mean, Apple's share price went down that day. Yeah. People thought that was a disaster of a decision. I quote Larry Ellison saying, like, Apple's never going to achieve the kind of success it had under Tim Cook because you need Steve Jobs at the helm of that company. And, the company has gone up by more than 10 times in value since the death of Steve Jobs. So there is this tension within Apple, like what makes us special? Is it how we design and conceive products, or is it how we make them? And really the answer is both, of course. But I mean, I think if you have Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive together, they're just making things that would end up in a museum. You need Tim Cook and Terry Guo to basically scale the hell out of those things to make it profitable, and to have them sold in something like 160 countries, at fat margins and sort of with immaculate quality. So it's odd that I think Apple is arguably the world's most covered company in terms of how many blogs there are, how many news reporters there are. A place like the New York Times literally has an Apple reporter, and yet we haven't paid due attention to the world-shaking activities that are necessary to build 230 million iPhones a year. And of course, the fact that there's this geopolitical story, because it's America's biggest adversary, where all the action is, a country that's sort of under heavy NDA if you're working for Apple, and under an opaque media environment because there's not free speech. I mean, you can sort of understand why the story hadn't been told, but you can also understand why it was sort of a silver platter of an idea to go tackle.
So Patrick, one interesting part of your book is how you describe the well-known tech leaders from a Western and unique perspective. For example, Terry Guo of Foxconn, Honghai. In your book, you call him Uncle Terry. In Taiwan, we usually call him Chairman Guo Dong, means very rich man. And the Foxconn is a leader in the EMS industry, from iPhones to Sony TVs and game consoles in the past, and now NVIDIA AI servers. So how do you see Terry Guo as a person and as a business leader?
I've called him the Henry Ford of Asia. I mean, I think he's ridiculously important. Foxconn was founded, obviously, by him in 1974.
Yeah.
It stuns me that there's not a major 700-page history of Foxconn or of Terry Guo in particular, right? Those are two books that both definitely need to be written, not by me, but I would love to read them. I quote someone that knows him really well, and they said any word in the English language could be used to describe Terry, and it would be accurate because he's so multifaceted.
Yeah.
Right? So you could call him ruthless, but you could also call him charming. I think the word that most often gets associated with him is cunning. And I think that's also because that's the word we use for foxes. And I think he calls the company Foxconn because fox was his favorite animal. And, in my narrative, I guess there's sort of two ways he really stands out. One is just how strategic he is. He seems to understand Apple's problems before Apple understands them. And so he's able to make bet the company decisions that position Foxconn in a way such that they receive more and more Apple orders. Famous example would be in 2010, he makes the decision that the iPad, the first one, and the iPhone 4 were going to be wildly successful, far more than Tim Cook believed. And so he made a decision on the spot to build a new campus in Chengdu, which is now known as iPad City, and another in Zhengzhou, now known as iPhone City. And the whole deal was, if I'm right, this is Terry, if I'm right about how much the volumes are going to be, I get the orders for all those products, right? And Tim Cook sees that as a no-risk decision and says, oh, sure, let's do it. And then the other thing, sort of more important, is that way back in 1999, Terry Guo and Foxconn were building products for all sorts of companies. And he's just the first person to really understand that Apple was asking things of the companies, of the contract manufacturers, that you weren't getting from Dell or HP or whatever. And other people understood that, but they saw it as an annoying thing. They saw Apple's demands as arrogant, and why would you want to work with this company that sends people to your factories, breathes down their neck, and asks too much? And Terry was the genius who understood that if we can please Apple and all those demanding things, then everything else is going to be easy, because Dell doesn't make those demands. So he understands that you don't make much money with Apple, but the learning you receive is second to none. And so he begins to really make major investments in Apple in the late 1990s, and obviously that paid off very, very well.
Okay. From an international media perspective, so how would you describe Steve Jobs and Tim Cook? They seem very different in product innovation and supply chain management. So how do they think differently, and how are they viewed by the Western public?
Too often I think Steve Jobs and Tim Cook are thought of as opposites.
Yeah.
And, it's obvious that they are in certain ways. Tim Cook doesn't have the charisma, he doesn't have the product design, the visionary appeal of Steve Jobs, and yet they have some really deep similarities too, which is that the attention to detail, the maniacal obsessiveness, etc. They both have that. They just apply it in different ways. So Steve Jobs applies it to the aesthetics of the products, but Tim Cook will apply it to the manufacturing yield, right? He'll make decisions that are sort of like that of Steve Jobs, but it's just not based on the aesthetics. It's based on the durability and whether it's going to make money for Apple and so forth. So they are sort of like two peas in a pod in that sense. But my favorite anecdote from someone pretty high up at Apple that had worked for both was that Steve Jobs was really difficult to work with because he could go from 0 to 100 emotionally, and Tim Cook was even more difficult to work with because he would go from 35 to 36, and you sort of never knew where you stood with him because he was so calm and icy.
Okay, and another question is for Patrick. So another key person is Zhang忠谋, the founder of TSMC. So in Taiwan, he's known as the godfather of the semiconductor industry. So many former TSMC VPs describe him as a commander or a general of the company, especially when Apple asked for the major process changes before mass production. So how would you describe Zhang?
Yeah, I mean, he's in the highest echelon of important executives in the last 100 years, right? I mean, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Morris Chang. I mean, you know, he really is as high as you can go. Without TSMC, there is no NVIDIA. And NVIDIA is the most important, valuable company in the world right now. I mean, everybody relies on TSMC. I think it's arguably the most important company in the world because NVIDIA, Apple, Google, Meta, anyone you can really think of, all rely on TSMC for the most important products that they're making, right? It's the compute within all of their products. So it's hard to overestimate, you know, it's hard to say too many good things about Morris Chang. He sort of fits all of them.
So tech leaders' stories are always fascinating. So today, the biggest rock star in tech is Jensen Huang,黄仁勋of NVIDIA. So he often talks about his strong relationship with Taiwan's partners. So how would you describe Jensen Huang as a leader?
I know less about Jensen. I haven't done any original reporting on him. And actually, I would say while I was off writing this book, the AI boom was completely taking off. NVIDIA's stock price was soaring, and everybody was interested in chatbots and AI. And it was a godsend to me because, of course, I think what I'm writing about is really important. But if every other journalist is thinking about something else, like that's sort of what you want in a book. You want it to be important, but like nobody else is thinking about it. So as everybody zigs, you zag. And so in a certain sense, I know less about Jensen and all these other things because everybody was covering that. And I decided to look at the geopolitics of hardware.
Sure. Okay, before we finish this part, I'll pass to Rod for a question again. So do you have any question for Patrick or for Eric?
Oh, just for Patrick. And Steve Jobs used to believe Apple have to control the hardware and even the manufacturing itself. But Apple later decided to fully embrace outsourcing mode. What do you see the real turning point itself?
So interestingly, the turning point, I think, comes at Apple before Steve Jobs returns, which is to say it's in 1996. Steve Jobs hasn't come back to the company, and they decide to sell their factory in Colorado. And it's basically because they don't have the money to support it and they're going to go bankrupt. So they actually have to adopt the outsourcing model out of complete necessity. And then when Steve Jobs does come back and he and Johnny Ive and the ID team come up with the candy-colored iMac, again, Steve Jobs wants to create it themselves, but they basically don't have the balance sheet and they also don't really know how to build the monitor, what at the time was called a CRT. And so they use their analog monitor supplier, which was LG, and they actually kind of turn them into a contract manufacturer. This is something I hadn't really considered until the book was published, but LG is not a contract manufacturer, but Apple just has such swagger that they basically made them into a contract manufacturer. And then LG, expands its production of that computer from not just Korea, but to Wales and Mexico. And so that itself is kind of an amazing story. But essentially what happens is like there's this 7-year period where Apple's building products on 3 continents and I think 8, maybe 9 countries. And then eventually China is able to basically demonstrate that it has, abundant, flexible labor, build to order factories, and it can just sort of outperform versus everybody. And so everything consolidates into China. So I remember talking to an executive that reported to Steve Jobs around 2005, and he said that for the product they were building, that they should be building it in America. And Steve Jobs said, I tried that, it didn't work. So he was absolutely someone that wanted to be building and wanted to be in control of building all the products, but out of financial desperation, they couldn't do it. And in that period, that sort of testing period when he was reluctantly allowing other companies to build, China very much proved its worth. And Apple sort of came up with a model that I don't really think is outsourcing, because outsourcing assumes that you, the company, design a product and then you work with a competent supplier to bring it into reality at whatever scale you want, right? There's an assumption that the factory already has the competence to do what you're asking it for. That's the normal outsourcing relationship. But what Apple does is sort of takes control of the factory, teaches everybody, does the engineering 101, and really sort of ends up owning the factory without literally owning. So I've compared Apple's approach to manufacturing like Uber's approach to having a ride-hail network, right? Biggest taxi provider in the world, doesn't own a single car.
So Eric, you recently completed a ranking of the top 20 global EMS companies. So can you share the key results and Taiwan's role in this ranking? Also, what are Taiwan's main advantages in server manufacturing?
Okay, I think Patrick, in your book, you mentioned many EMS companies, from SCI, Seminar, to like Fastcom, Quanta, Inventec, Pegatron, and luxury, etc. And I would like to share with you about the newest competitive landscape.
Okay. Good.
Okay, so we do track the biggest EMS by quarter, and here's the year 2025 ranking.
Okay.
We just rank top 20 EMS companies.
Yep.
You know who is the number one?
It must still be Foxconn.
Yes, must be Foxconn. But let me show you one number. Foxconn's revenue for last year is 206.1 billion US dollars, and YOY growth rate 22%. Very high growth rate.
Data servers.
But the number two, Wistron.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Okay, and Wistron's growth rate 116%.
Wow. I know their stock price has gone,
Yes,
way up. Yeah.
skyrocket.
Yeah.
And Quanta, number three, 56% growth. Number four, Luxury,
Yes.
26 growth rate. And number five, Pegatron, growth rate 2%.
Oh.
What's the difference? And what's the driving force for to trigger the ranking change? Two waves. One is consumer electronics. Second is AI. And as you know, for the past few years, consumer electronics, not just consumer electronics, but also including like smartphone and notebook, PC, etc. We call it 3C, computer, consumer electronics, and communication devices. And all the mass market devices market are saturated. Only have like 0 to 5% growth rate for past 10 years. So EMS company need to find new driving force. AI is a new driving force, So after ChatGPT launch in late 2022, suddenly Taiwanese EMS maker, they find new drivers because NVIDIA co-work with Taiwanese supply chain very well for past 30 to 40 years. So NVIDIA know how to co-work with Taiwanese supply chain. When NVIDIA GPU find new applications, especially for AI training, then there's a big generative AI revolution triggered by NVIDIA's GPU. Mm-hmm. So for the past 3 years, not just NVIDIA's revenue, but also Taiwanese partners, many of them enjoy 3-digit growth rate.
Yes.
But on the other hand, for consumer electronics, we've seen that the Chinese suppliers like Luxury, like BYD Electronics, mm-hmm. like LY iTech, one of the Apple's key supplier, and the Lens Technology.
Yes.
They grow very well because they grab orders from their competitors, and they do vertical integration. They do more and more components and do more and more assembly jobs, and they acquire other companies, so they become bigger and bigger. So I think there are two driving forces for this ranking. One is for consumer electronics, but the major emerging force are Chinese EMS suppliers. The other one is AI. Major drive Taiwanese, not just Taiwanese suppliers, but also for the US EMS suppliers like Flex, like JBL, like Seminar, and like Celestica. But I think the major issue that Apple's order is not as important as before.
Yes.
Because now hyperscalers, NVIDIA, they become the bigger and bigger customer or strategic partner. So I think the supply chain has been tried to diversify their customer, diversify their market, not only count on Apple.
Yeah, so there's something I love about this story and then something that I don't love so much, right? Okay, so the part that I love is that if you're thinking in sort of grandest view, right? We're really in like a sort of like market-based capitalism, right? And represented by Taiwan and the United States, and like party-state capitalism represented by China. And what's great about their first statistics, right, especially the first 3 companies there, is that the Taiwanese had worked so closely with Apple and really become complete experts in the consumer area for 20 years that even though they're getting squeezed out of the Apple supply chain, they were able to use their skill sets on something that was faster growing. And it sort of demonstrates the nimbleness of like the entrepreneurial spirit rather than a sort of top-down view of like you should be doing this kind of sector. So it thrills me, right, that these Taiwanese companies are able to find the next best thing after the smartphone and capitalize on it and become world leaders.
You know, Apple's margin is too low, so
Yeah,
they don't want
exactly.
to
No,
take
it's far more lucrative, so it's great. The part I don't like, of course, is that, you know, for all the diversification that we talked about earlier about Apple's moving to Vietnam and moving to India, the quid pro quo that Apple has basically said to their Chinese counterparts, right, is yes, we're moving certain things outside of China, but the operations that we have in China will become more Chinese. So the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and the American multinationals, they're all being squeezed out in favor of the red supply chain, and that's why you have Luxshare.
China for China.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you know, Apple, Luxshare's number 1 client is Apple.
Yeah.
They're the one pushing them. And same with BYD Electronic, Gore-Tex, and Wingtech.
Yeah.
Okay, Patrick. So in your book, you argue that Apple helped create China's manufacturing dominance. So, but today, the world's most advanced chips are mainly made in Taiwan by TSMC.
Yeah.
The U.S. government wants semiconductor manufacturing to return to the U.S. However, many experts, including most John, believe this is not cost-effective. So, do you agree with this U.S. strategy? And what is your view?
So let me first say that someone very senior in the chip sector says my book doesn't go far enough because it says I make the case that Apple was the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, sort of Beijing's plans to become an autarky and give rise to indigenous innovation. And he said that's the story of TSMC as well, that Apple has been the biggest client of TSMC for about 14 years. And the demands that they would make on how the fabs would produce their chips were so intricate and complex and costly that it was the driving force for making TSMC number 1 versus Samsung, which was Apple's previous fab. That's fascinating if true. I'm not going to write Apple in Taiwan, but someone could maybe. And sorry, what was the second half of the question?
The second part is, what is your view about the U.S. strategy?
Oh, or TSMC strategy, right? About diversifying to Arizona?
Yeah.
I do think they need to do that. But I think TSMC is playing it really smartly, which is that they are diversifying to Arizona, Japan, and Germany, but they're leaving the most bleeding edge, cutting edge nodes in Taiwan. So they're sort of maintaining the silicon shield for Taiwan, but also diversifying their business, right? In the same way that Apple shouldn't have everything in China, I don't think TSMC, given how world-class it is, should have everything in Taiwan. But it would be a major mistake to leave Taiwan, right? Or even to have its most cutting-edge things outside. So I think actually they're pulling off the strategy remarkably well.
Okay. Eric, from a supply chain research view, so how do you see the idea of made in America for semiconductors?
I think from the U.S. point of view, the global landscape has shifted away from the post-World War II era of unilateral U.S. hegemony and toward a state of U.S.-China confrontation. So that forced the U.S. government to prepare for potential Cold War or even hot war, I think. Yeah. So for national security and supply chain security reasons, I think the U.S. must establish domestic manufacturing capabilities across several strategic sectors, including AI semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, naval vessels, etc. So I think if you are a U.S. government official, can you accept a situation where over 90% of the advanced wafer process capacity located in Taiwan, and 90% of the advanced packaging capacity concentrated in Taiwan, especially under the cross-strait tension situation? I think if you are official, no. So we have no choice but to accept the political reality and take it as it is. So on the other hand, as Taiwan because Taiwan is a small island, we have a constraint on our resources, including electricity, water, and the talents.
Yeah.
It's neither feasible or appreciable to over-concentrate these critical resources into one company, TSMC. So TSMC overseas expansion is inevitable, and I think it's a necessary strategy. Good for the US and good for Taiwan. Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, this question is for Eric and for Patrick. So both Terry Gou and Amos Zhang have retired. So how would you describe the current leaders, Yang Liu Yangwei at Foxconn, and the CC Wei Zhejia at TSMC? Eric?
Me first?
Yeah, you first.
Okay. I think Yang Liu and the CC Wei face different challenges compared to Terry and Morse. First from Foxconn, okay? Terry built the EMS empire from scratch. As you mentioned in the book, he leveraged China to produce every electronic devices and did the vertical integration as possible as he can, and serve Apple well. That's his secret policy, secret source, successful source. And I think Yang's challenge is Foxconn has been the #1 ES company for over at least 10 years. How to grow the revenue as high growth rate, and how to improve the profit margin. That's his challenge. And under the current market and the geopolitical situation. So I think AI and EV are two key markets which need to be captured. Foxconn is the biggest winner to grab AI server rack orders, no matter they are based on NVIDIA, AMD, or ACE platforms. But the EV business is an entire new business, and Yang Liu has cooked this business since he took the position. Although facing the fierce competition from China, in contrast to the technology product supply chain, the automotive supply chain remains highly bureaucratized and lack of the capacity to rapid transformation. So I think that's Yang Liu's challenge. As for TSMC, Morris' challenge was how to grow the company from scratch. He need to build the customer trust first. He need to push the company from a technology follower to technology leader, from small capacity to advanced capacity leader, and build a service ecosystem around TSMC. CC's challenge is not growing the revenue, not the issue to grow, because TSMC is dominant in advanced technology and advanced packaging. So his challenge is risk management and globalization. And when you manage in the fab, especially in the US, huge investment and political uncertainty during the Trump administration, I think that's the biggest challenge. And the second challenge is that TSMC is too strong. So TSMC will be a target to, for such as antitrust or other political issue. So the second challenge is how to de-risk from this kind of issue. So TSMC need to nurture distance number 2. TSMC need to nurture his competitor to grab market share and to have some market share in advanced technology and advanced package to de-risk his business.
So I basically agree with all of that. I would say, TSMC, we already talked about the geographical expansion and why I think that makes sense. The only, I think, potential problem is they're not wanting to, you talked about risk management. I think they're probably being too risk averse right now. They're not putting in the spending of building new fabs that someone like Elon Musk wants. And Elon's potential response is that they're going to build a terafab somewhere in America. What's that? Yeah, he wants to build his own fab. There's another startup in San Francisco that wants to build their own fabs, right? And it's because of the geopolitical environment and I guess the monopoly that TSMC has. So the degree to which they surprise investors with how much they're willing to invest, I think could go a long way. But I say that with no skin in the game. TSMC knows better than I do that if they make those major investments and the AI bubble bursts, then they're sitting on a lot of unused capacity. So I understand that it's a big dilemma, but I would say that's we're gonna figure out the next 5 years whether or not they're being far too cautious. With Foxconn, I think we've already answered the question in the fact that I think something like 60% of their revenue is already in data centers and AI, which is phenomenal. So it tells you that they've made the correct pivot. I think I'm more optimistic in that than I am optimistic that they're going to replay the playbook they did in mainland China in India. They don't have the same language and culture. India isn't sort of in the same position to have a sort of militant environment with the same factories. You don't have a sort of top-down view from New Delhi that manufacturing is our way out of 100 years of humiliation and so forth. So I think the cultural differences between India and China are just so vast that I would put my money on Tata being successful in India more than I would in Foxconn.
Okay. But before we move on, let's have Rod ask a question again.
Okay, Patrick, you quoted Apple engineers in this book saying that Foxconn may have seen Apple's future success even earlier than Apple itself. It's very interesting. How do you describe this situation?
I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that Foxconn had so many different clients, and it was able, if you just sort of lay out your clients like that, you would realize that Apple was unlike any of the others, right? And so I think he just had a certain purview that maybe you wouldn't have in insular Cupertino. Often when you talk to people at Apple, they don't know what's going on outside of Apple. They're in their own little bubble. Terry, just by definition, is never in a bubble because he's got so many different clients. And so I think it was just easier for him to understand that Apple was really unique. And he also had great faith in Tim Cook. He already knew Tim Cook when he was at Compaq. And so I think he was just able to really put together that if you've got like the magic of Steve Jobs' imagination and the competence of Tim Cook, this was going to be a great company to work for. This doesn't sound like an interesting point, by the way, because now we know what Apple was capable of. But he was making this decision when people are being hired at Apple, their bosses were saying, why would you go to that bankrupt company? This is going to be the stupidest decision in your life, right? So you have to remember that Terry Guo was making those decisions at a time when Steve Jobs wasn't really all that proven as a great CEO, right? He'd sort of made his money through Pixar, but at Apple, he'd been basically a failure and was kicked out of his own company. And Tim Cook was an unknown quantity, essentially. So Terry basically understood Apple in the way that we understand it today, but he was doing it 25 years ago.
Patrick, AI is the hottest topic in the tech industry today. So many AI leaders such as Jensen Huang, Lisa Su, Lip-Bu Tan, and Hock Tan from Broadcom work closely with Taiwan and TSMC. So you deeply analyze Apple and China in your book. So how do you see the AI supply chain in Taiwan today? So do you see any risks?
Well, I think we just saw that the Taiwanese are doing really, really well in the rankings. So it sort of depends on the geopolitical environment, right? I mean, if you're just looking at the business numbers, then I think everything's basically looking great and the Taiwanese are doing wonderfully. And then you have to factor in that, wait a minute, Xi Jinping, dictator in China, has literally said things like, we're not leaving the Taiwan question for the next generation. And he's ordered his military to be ready to take over the island by 2027. I mean, even while I'm in Taiwan this week, right, one of the Financial Times big headlines was that in December, they were conducting military exercises that sometimes, U.S. officials say they're not exercises, they're rehearsals, right? Because this is how seriously you have to take it. So it just sort of depends. Are we just talking about business numbers? Or are we talking about the, potential consequences of Taiwan being absorbed into the mainland? And, and that's why this matters for everybody. Obviously it matters. It's way more visceral to anyone who's in Taiwan. But the whole AI boom is literally like driving the American economy right now. I'm sure it's driving the Taiwanese economy. And yet so much is all on this one little island. And if somehow that gets absorbed into China, we're in a whole different reality where certain U.S. officials have said, they would rather bomb TSMC's fabs than have them become Chinese.
Yeah.
So, the question is, if you're an investor, and I'm not a shareholder in any of these companies, how do you factor that in, right? How much money do you pummel into these companies? Because we just see the results. They're doing amazing. But how do you factor in the possibility that it all blows up one day? I don't know.
Okay. As a supply chain expert, so how can Taiwan reduce risk and seize opportunities at the same time?
I think for Taiwan's supply chain, if we have orders, then we will be fine. So the first issue is that whether we can get enough order. So I think from a client side point of view, when the non-China's electronics brand or tech service brand compete with Chinese seasoned electronic product brands and service brand, who will win? If the US and the US ally win, then we can have enough orders because we can serve the US customer and other like Japanese customer very well and the European customer very well. So, but Chinese brand has become strong and stronger and stronger. So you see in the smartphone segment, besides Apple and Samsung, other major brands are Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese brand.
Okay, Chinese brands. And in EV segment, BYD now is the number one, and Tesla, shipment keep declining.
Yeah.
So that's the critical issue. So US brand, whether US brand can keep winning the market share in the future in the new products like humanoid, like EVs, like AI glasses. If they can, then we could continue to have good orders. If they lost, then Chinese brand will use their own supply chain. So for Taiwanese supply chain, we will have little market opportunity to grab orders. I think that's the key fundamental issue.
If I was to say one more thing on it, I would say, we have to talk about humanoid robotics, right? There's more than 100 humanoid companies in China, and they're basically following the involution model that was applied to electric vehicles. So all kinds of electric vehicle companies in China will not make it, but they go through such a vigorous, like Darwinian struggle that the end results are, BYD and Xiaomi doing amazing things in EVs. And if that happens in humanoid robotics, China's going to absolutely lead.
Yeah, Patrick. So China's push for technology self-reliance continues. So what path do you think China will take in the future?
Yeah, well, I think they've already basically doubled down on Made in China 2025. And I would say if there's one thing that people don't seem to get from the book, they think it's a history. And of course, it is a history. But nothing that I talk about has ended. It's not as though Apple is no longer sending their world's top minds into Chinese factories to help them with this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. That's still going on, right? The investments that I talk about that people think are so astounding, I'm largely relying on documents that I have from a decade ago. The figures that they're investing in China these days are higher than they were a decade ago. So there's no sense in which the narrative is somehow over and now we're in a new era. Apple and China remain married. It's a good marriage for both of them, but there's collateral damage from anyone who's not part of that marriage, and part of the damage is that industrial capacity in America has very much been hollowed out. I think that's a problem in peacetime. It's unimaginable in a time of war, and we're already seeing that when Trump and Xi negotiate, basically global trade deals, I think it's pretty obvious that Xi is the one who holds the cards, to sort of quote Donald Trump, what he once said to the leader of Ukraine. So, the consequences of building up your adversary into a technological manufacturing Goliath are quite profound. And unfortunately, I think the book is only going to be more relevant in the coming 5 to 10 years. I would love for it to be totally inconsequential by 2035 because Apple and other companies have diversified their electronics expertise around the world. But I'm really not seeing that happening.
Okay, Eric. So how do you see the future of China's tech industry?
I think China's tech industry will become bigger and stronger than ever. Because I think reason one is that China's domestic market now is a very innovative market, and this innovative and scale market drive their supply chain development, drive the scale of the supply chain. For example, quantum, VTOL, humanoid, robotics, AI glasses, all the emerging area. For example, if humanoid, as you mentioned, if there are 200 humanoid brands, I think 50% are Chinese brands, and 25% are the US brands, and the other 25% are like Japanese, Korean, or European brands. So all the brand will place order to the humanoid supply chain because China has 50% of the global brand. So even in the emerging phase of the market life cycle, they can create scale for their supply chain because all the 50% of the Chinese brand, all the Chinese brand will place the order to their supply chain. So during the emergent phase, their supply chain already have the economical scale. So when other market take off, they can have a great learning curve and lower costs and great performance. So they can compete with other region suppliers, and they high possibility they will win the order. That's reason one. The second reason is that right now China can have many of the electronic components. As for the edge AI devices, that's the next big market. Now they have enough semiconductor capacity. And for edge devices, they don't need advanced technology like 2 nanometer. So China's 14 nanometer technology, 7 nanometer technology are good enough for the edge devices, SoCs. So China can have comprehensive supply chain to support, to provide the everything of the edge devices, edge AI device need. So I think China's supply chain will become bigger and stronger.
Okay. The final question is for Patrick. So the U.S. still leads the world in innovation, capital, and the markets. So what challenges and the new opportunities do you think the U.S. will face in the coming years?
Well, it's funny. I went to a conference called Reindustrialize last year in Detroit, and my Canadianness comes out because it struck me as such an American event, which is where entrepreneurs, one after the other, are all talking about how they're going to invent their way out of the problem. And almost none of them talk about scale. And scale is where we're losing, right? Scale is the dominant advantage that China has. So it's not about just having a better drone. It's about, I think it was Stalin who once said, quantity is its own form of quality. And that's sort of what China understands in spades. So, China's great advantage is really learning by doing, learning from everybody, and then sort of absorbing that and reimagining it on an epic scale. And so if America's going to compete, in a sense, that's what they need to be doing. The only difference I had an opinion a few minutes ago was I don't think America needs to reshore so many different industries. I do want to see some reshoring, but ally shoring I think is fine. I don't really mind if America is quote unquote dependent on Canada and Mexico and India. Those are nations that it can trade and create interdependence with. In a certain sense, that is how America won the Cold War versus the Soviet Union. It was this great network of world trade. The problem is so much trade happens with China. And I'm okay with trade with China. I mean, that's basically fine. It's the complete complete consolidation in the most crucial sectors for the 21st century. It's all in China. So you think about how much China's dominance is in refining and mining of rare earths, of the lithium-ion battery chain, which is necessary for all the green technology. Same thing with solar panels. The same story is playing out with pharmaceuticals. I mean, the chokeholds that China is deliberately developing are awe-inspiring, except that I'm not in favor of it, right? So this is why it's such a major problem.
Okay, thanks for amazing sharing. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Patrick, Eric, and Rod. I'm Julian Ho. Thank you for watching and welcome to Taiwan.
Thanks, Julian.
Today's discussion has been insightful and full of different perspectives. DIGITIMES is based in Taiwan, but we also operate an international English platform. Every month, more than 3 million readers visit DIGITIMES. We provide professional service in news, research, and consulting, and work with leading companies such as top 5 tech giants. We look forward to more exchange with international authors like Patrick McGee. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Patrick, Eric, and Rod. I'm Julian Ho. Thank you for watching. 这一次的苹果在中国特别访谈节目就告一段落了，感谢大家的收看，我们下次见喽，拜拜。